by the end of it.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I could ever switch to, 3 days a week, an hour a time. Really interesting topic.
I haven't done that. You didn't have it.
2 days a week. Mine are an
No, we
hour
do
and
1
20
day.
minutes.
3 hours. And then I actually start the program. I go for 6 hours on it on 1 day.
Actually, I could use my voice. I
Yeah.
feel like I need to doing it right.
Well, you have to really plan the session. I feel you put so many to break it up. Because no one wants to listen to me.
Yeah, you don't want to talk for 6 hours straight. Try to find some.
So you have the games, the activities, the interactive stuff.
Good turnout. I do apologize in advance for the ones who sit back.
It does not bother me.
Well, it doesn't, I'm used to it teaching, but it upsets me so much when students do that for guest lecturers and people, donating their time. Anyway, I'm building up to a big lecture one of these days. I'm going to get up here and just say, shut that up.
I choose to read but take down every word I say.
Good way to handle it.
Yeah, that would be
Proud.
A female member, they would write off the
Good afternoon. Welcome to this week's ITS seminar. I am delighted to introduce today's speaker, Hillary Nixon. I was going to say Cynthia Nixon. Does that happen?
Say Hillary Clinton.
No. Okay. Hillary Nixon, who is an associate professor and now the chair of the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at San Jose State University, where she is also a research associate with the Mineta Transportation Institute. So she's going to share with us some of her very interesting and important transportation research today. But I do want to note that you have a very diverse set of research interests. So she does work also on household hazardous waste management, e-recycling in particular, and have an interest in environmental behavior more generally. So let's welcome Hillary.
Okay. Thank you, Susan, and a particular thank you to ITS UC Davis for inviting me here. It's just delightful to be here today. It's particularly exciting for me to be here talking about alternative fuel vehicles and preferences for alternative fuel vehicles because there's an incredible wealth of expertise here on campus, here in the room. And so I'm really hoping we have a really interesting discussion, interactive discussion on these issues. So the focus of my presentation today is a research project that I conducted with Jean-Daniel Safor, who's down at UC Irvine. And it was funded by the Mineta Transportation Institute. And really what we were doing was a nationwide survey of household preferences, looking at different alternative fuel vehicle technologies. Before I delve into the research study itself, I wanted to just kind of set the stage, and I guess I'm probably preaching to the choir, talking to experts in the field, but gives a little bit of background and some context for alternative fuel vehicle use here in the U.S. So the chart I'm showing right now tracks alternative fuel vehicles in use in the United States over the last, 10, 15 years or so. Just a couple caveats on the graph itself. The way alternative fuel vehicles are categorized within the Transportation Energy Data book is that it excludes hybrid electric vehicles as well as plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And then when they're looking at flex fuel vehicles, so we have actually a huge number, probably about 10 million or so, give or take, flex fuel capable vehicles here in the U.S., and those would be most commonly operating either switching between gasoline and the E85 blend. So this chart will only look at those flex fuel E85 vehicles. They're actually operated as alternative fuel vehicles, which are mainly fleet vehicles. So you're definitely seeing increasing trends, which I think is particularly interesting for those of us who are hoping to see more alternative fuel technologies on the road. Probably an average of about 10% growth a year. However, in the grand scheme of things, when you look at all the vehicles on the roads, alternative fuel vehicles are still just a tiny, tiny drop in the bucket among the vehicles driving around today. Looking just specifically at 1 year and kind of what the breakdown is, again, not looking at hybrid vehicles and only looking at those E85s that are used as alternative fuel vehicles, we see a breakdown with the E85, obviously the largest group, and then you've got, kind of a smaller group with liquid petroleum, which is kind of a propane-type vehicle, compressed natural gas, so concepts we're all pretty familiar with. Now talking about hybrids and plug-in hybrids, because I think this is where a lot of people are seeing kind of the trend going in the recent years. So this shows increase in hybrid and plug-in hybrid sales a little bit over the past decade or so. And so definitely showing an increasing share. They currently have about 3.5% of the total share of all light vehicle sales in the U.S. And this accounts for the plug-ins being introduced in late 2010 or so. Having said that, and having all this great data on, increasing trends and sales of alternative fuel vehicles, I did also want to, put this in perspective. This chart shows the top vehicle sales from September 2013. Here in the United States, we love our big trucks. So you've got the Ford F-Series, the Chevy Silverado, the Dodge Ram, right up there in the top 3 or 4, certainly in the top 5 types of vehicles for sales in the U.S. And this is not an unusual statistic. This isn't an anomaly. This has really been like this for quite some time. Now I should say that, many of these vehicles, certainly the Toyota and the Honda, all have alternative fuel vehicle options, but even the Ford, the Chevy, and the Dodge all do have alternative fuel vehicle or hybrid options, but they're still a pretty tiny percent of the total sales of that vehicle. So now that we have kind of a little bit of the context of kind of the status and state of alternative fuel vehicle use and sales in the U.S., I wanted to talk more about the project that I did with Jean Daniel. So as I mentioned at the beginning, what we did was a nationwide survey. And what we were looking at was kind of to assess and evaluate preferences, how people would rank and pick between different alternative fuel vehicle technologies, comparing 4 different technologies, hybrids, and this was not a plug-in hybrid. And in fact, I'll talk in a sec a little bit about why we didn't pick a plug-in hybrid. But a hybrid, compressed natural gas, hydrogen fuel cell, electric vehicles, and then folks all did have a very conventional vehicle option to consider as well. And what we were looking at was how do we estimate trade-offs between cost, environmental performance, vehicle range. You hear that term range anxiety, particularly as it relates to alternative fuel vehicles, electrics. What happens when I've gone my 40 miles and I want to go 60 miles? Or what happens when I've run out of fuel and I can't find a fueling station that services the alternative fuel needs that my vehicle has? So these types of trade-offs are pretty commonly addressed in the literature on alternative fuel vehicles. But it's a more complex issue when you think about the buying behavior. And so we tried to survey people to really kind of understand why were they making their choices. Now, we use what's called a stated preference technique. There's kind of 2 ways commonly used to evaluate these trade-offs. One is called stated preference. Some of you might have heard of studies such as contingent valuation or willingness to pay studies. And then the other is revealed preference. Now, the advantage of revealed preference data is that you get actual sales data. And if you have a sufficient body of sales data with lots of different pieces of data, lots of different vehicles, you can evaluate and trade off and estimate the value of having a two-door versus a four-door car, storage space, performance, mileage, all these different features. But unfortunately, with alternative fuel vehicles, we just don't have enough data pieces to do that kind of econometric modeling. So we rely on these stated preference surveys. The way we did ours, and I was going to mention kind of why we didn't include the plug-in hybrids. Human beings have a limited capacity to evaluate alternatives. You know, I could have listed every single different type of alternative fuel vehicle and all kinds of different characteristics for people to trade off. But even though we have this incredibly magnificent brain, we have a limited capacity to actually make choices between such a large set of alternatives. And with the hybrids versus the plug-in hybrids, and because we were also including electric vehicles, I needed to have enough difference between each vehicle type and the characteristics and the body of characteristics that I was looking at. So that's kind of why we ended up not including the plug-in hybrid, although I'd be certainly willing to kind of debate and argue, you know, was that the right decision? So the survey itself, and we administered the survey just before the Chevy Volt and the Nissan Leaf were on the market. So people had heard about some of these new technologies. They might have seen an article on television or in the newspaper or a radio show talking about them, but they hadn't yet been able to buy one or test drive one yet. We used an internet-based survey, and we actually worked with a company called Knowledge Networks. And Knowledge Networks is kind of an unusual survey entity. Basically, what they do is they have a 43,000 member panel that participate and have agreed to participate in taking these surveys. It's certainly beneficial for us academics because it gives us this built-in body to pick from. But what they do is they recruit all their participants by telephone. So everyone is recruited into the panel by telephone. And then if they have, or if they don't have internet service, Knowledge Networks will provide them with internet service. Or if they're using their own device, they'll provide them with, you know, some sort of incentive points for participating in the surveys that then they can then turn in for various different prizes and even in some cases cash payments. The nice thing about it, certainly from a research perspective, is I am guaranteed the demographic information. So they have a complete set of demographic information of their panel that they update every single year. We contacted about 1,400, and we had about 835 respondents, which is, you know, not unusual for Knowledge Networks, pretty normal actually, and certainly much better than we probably would have gotten on our own, you know, purchasing a mailing list and trying to send it out. What it also gave us the advantage, particularly using this internet method, is we could customize an awful lot more of the survey. We used a method called contingent ranking, which I'll also talk about a little bit more. But unlike a lot of willingness to pay studies where they ask individuals to state, you know, would you pay $10 or would you pay $20 for whatever this service was or whatever this good was? With contingent ranking, what we did is we presented respondents with 5 alternatives, and individuals ranked them 1 through 5. Again, one of the reasons why I couldn't have too many alternatives, because we just don't have the mental capacity to really effectively evaluate more than about 3 to 5 alternatives. But because I was delivering the survey from via the internet, I could really customize it. So a lot of times when you do these surveys, you get a survey in the mail, and you get 5 scenarios, and you look at the 5 scenarios, and you say, okay, car 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I will rank car 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They have different characteristics. It's a different bundle of goods. I'll evaluate them. What we did was, as people were participating in the survey, we were actually getting pretty detailed information about not only their current vehicle ownership situation, but also their plans, so that we knew whether or not they were planning to purchase a truck, a minivan, an SUV, a small compact car, a mid-sized car, that kind of thing. And we could customize the scenarios that were presented based on that type of individual information. You can never do that in a mail survey, and these kind of surveys are actually pretty hard to do by phone because they're rather complex and they require that time spent comparing the two alternatives. So in fact, an online survey is a pretty nice way of doing it. So the survey itself consisted of 3 parts. The first part, we were looking at views on a variety of transportation-related issues, everything from concerns about congestion, safety, environmental impacts of vehicles, as well as more broadly, we were interested in people's behavior related to technology adoption. Now, this was not necessarily related specifically to transportation technologies, but, are you the first person to grab the latest and greatest iPhone or whatever other, kind of neat new technology is out there? Were you one of these early adopter kind of individuals? I mentioned that we also got a whole lot of information on their current vehicle ownership as well as their future purchasing plans to help customize the survey. And then we did the contingent ranking exercise itself. So with the contingent ranking exercise, what we were trying to do, and we started first on kind of their likely buying behavior over the next 9 years. Now, why did we pick 9 years? Well, it actually relates to how long the average typical car owner keeps their car, and about how often people are turning over their cars. Now, when I sit back and I think about this, while yes, we were asking them to project back out the next 9 years, I'm guessing people were probably only giving us the next 2 to 4 years in terms of their plans for actually buying a new car. But we did ask over the next 9 years. And only those people that indicated they were planning to purchase a vehicle over the next 9 years was presented with the contingent ranking. But most people did. In fact, we had well over 50% of the respondents participate in the contingent ranking exercise. And then another thing that we did was we wanted to make sure we got relatively consistent rankings. I have no way of getting inside someone's brain and saying, I really need you to think about this. I want you to look at these alternatives and really thoughtfully compare them and consider them. Some people are going to get your survey and they're going to see alternatives 1 through 5 and they're just going to go first, second, third, fourth, fifth. They're not really going to think about it. So one of the things that we did was we actually had people participate in this activity multiple iterations. In fact, often they were looking at up to 9 times, depending on how many cars they planned to purchase over the next 9 years. People were given the option to select up to 3 cars, 3 new vehicles. We also had to consider a manageable subset of attributes, again, related to the brain capacity. And another important feature we wanted was you can look at what are called main effects. So certainly we were interested in these trade-offs between, cost, performance, range, all those characteristics I talked about earlier. But we were also interested in really important interactions. We were looking at things, does the vehicle type matter? Whether it's, an SUV, a truck, a minivan, a compact car. We were looking at demographic characteristics. Attitudes, environmental attitudes, concerns about greenhouse gas emissions and climate change and those kind of things. Well, if we wanted to capture every single one of those interactions, we actually had about 12,000 different combinations. We could have presented our poor, group of 800 survey respondents. In fact, a little bit fewer, about 500, 600 or so actually participated in the exercise. We were able to narrow it down to a total of about 110 different scenarios that really would capture and give us enough statistical information to do the modeling for all of the main and those second-order interactions. We grouped the attributes into kind of 3 main categories. if you look at almost any literature, previous research on alternative fuels, this is basically kind of the set that they're going to look at. Now, obviously, the specific features will vary, but they're going to look at monetary features, price, fuel costs. We did assume kind of similar maintenance costs across all the vehicles, which again is something that we could argue was a good or not so good idea. One of the reasons we didn't include the maintenance is we didn't actually have a whole lot of information on some of the maintenance costs for some of the alternative fuel vehicles. And we also assumed that if you had an alternative fuel vehicle, maybe one of these newer technologies that was going to maybe experience pretty high maintenance cost, the dealer themselves might throw in kind of one of those packages. We'll cover your basic maintenance costs for the first 5 years, or those kind of, we'll guarantee the battery for 10 years or something like that. We looked at non-monetary characteristics, range, refueling time, fuel availability, and then some very, very basic environmental characteristics really captured through greenhouse gas emissions. Now, on the far right-hand column, I kind of give a qualitative description of what some of these different variations of attributes might have been. We tried to make it as realistic as possible, so we worked with manufacturers and whatever existing data we could gather at the time to kind of get an idea of what's likely to be the purchase price, again, across a truck, an SUV, a small car, even a luxury car for your, Tesla aficionados out there. But do a low and a high type, high estimate. Same thing with the fuel costs, a low and a high estimate. For the range, with the exception of EVs, most of these alternative fuels tend to have a somewhat similar range. So it was really the electric vehicles that had varying ranges that we considered. Refueling was interesting because we looked at refueling time, but for the electric vehicles, you have this issue of recharging. And depending on how you drive your car, and most people who are purchasing these EVs are most likely going to be looking at some kind of home recharging, but whether you were doing kind of the 220 volts versus the 110 volts, so some of you probably live in that battery world where that you have your regular household socket that you can plug in, recharge your car, but it takes a whole lot longer, or if you upgrade to one of those kind of heavier duty, the type of outlet that you might plug in your dryer to, or kind of a major household appliance, or even have installed one of the more expensive home recharging systems. You can recharge your vehicle faster. But we also wanted to give people an option when they're out and about to hopefully control that range anxiety issue. And there'd been discussion at the time about these battery swap locations where you could go in, drive up your car, have your battery swapped out. And we considered kind of two different types of that. We considered this a battery swap in 10 minutes or a kind of a super fast kind of ultra turbo recharging opportunity. We also looked at fuel availability, and this would have been based on kind of the extra time to find a station that provided the fuel that you were looking for, or in the case of EVs, one of these either battery swaps or this kind of super fast turbocharging system. And then the greenhouse gas emissions we basically just did as a comparison to gasoline, and we were only looking at local emissions. So we didn't get into kind of the complex issue of if you're driving an EV, but your electricity is being generated at a coal-fired power plant, thousands of miles away. We didn't get into that issue. So kind of present some of the results. Now the first bullet point on the screen was, for me, actually kind of one of the more disappointing, although probably not surprising, results. There's unfortunately a real lack of knowledge and understanding among at least our survey participants, which were generally representative. You compared them to U.S. demographics, and they looked and sounded just like any other, kind of average U.S. resident. But there was a real lack of knowledge regarding the environmental impacts of vehicles. Many people, when we asked these series of questions to try to get at this issue, a lot of people did very honestly tell us, you want to know what? I just don't know. But another, pretty large number gave us completely wrong answers. And in fact, we never came across a situation with these questions where we ever got a majority of people telling us a correct answer to anything related to these environmental impact questions, which is kind of disappointing, but an opportunity as well. If you're wanting to look at, thinking of these alternative fuel technologies as an environmental opportunity, if we could increase knowledge and awareness, maybe there'd be greater interest. We also asked people kind of what were the factors that influenced their past purchasing decisions, and we very much repeat a similar set of questions after we do the ranking exercise to kind of understand, well, why did they give us the ranking that they did? Again, you see things like reliability, price performance up at the top, and then those issues of environmental impacts really had not played a factor. Now again, some of these people have had these cars a very long time, so things might have changed. It was one of the reasons why we were hoping to see with the ranking decision something like environmental impacts raise a little bit higher. I'll save those results for the grand finale. And then what I have on this slide, this is kind of lumping the rankings to kind of give an idea of, just in a consolidative, collective manner, what were people's fuel preferences? Now, I mentioned that we also looked at all these interactions with the modeling, and I'll talk about those, because those, I think, are a little bit more telling and give us a lot more kind of the subtle differences and issues that people were playing off. This is a chart that shows the average across all 9 rankings for the entire set of respondents, so everybody in the U.S. I realize I'm standing in front of the slide for some of you. So what you're seeing, and I'm guessing this probably doesn't come as a whole big surprise to people in the room, but gasoline conventional vehicles were still coming to the top. Hybrids, and actually I'm going to show you California data in the next slide, so that might give you even more, oh, yeah, okay, California is a little bit different. So the hybrids were definitely up there. No one technology, although hybrids certainly seemed to come to the top, no one alternative fuel technology was really overwhelmingly loved, although you definitely see that electric vehicles electric vehicles were definitely the least loved. And there was just a kind of a whole lot of concern people had once they were doing the rankings of the electric vehicles. What I think is kind of nice is you see gas ranked last, or the conventional vehicle ranked last, almost as often as you saw it ranked first. Now, the data for California is a little bit different and probably reflects a little bit more of what we actually see driving around the roads here. Here you basically see kind of a complete flip-flop between the hybrids and the conventional gasoline vehicles. The number in the parentheses, these were the national numbers, and then we're comparing them to the California numbers, which is not shown in parentheses. That you're seeing, obviously, that flip-flop between the hybrids and the conventional, and you're even seeing a little bit more love or fondness for electric vehicles. You're still not seeing them up in that top choice for people, but you're seeing more movement into kind of that third, fourth, even a little bit into the second, which I think probably reflects the fact that a lot of people don't necessarily think of this as a primary vehicle. They're often saying, well, I'll have that conventional vehicle where I can get in my car in San Francisco and drive to Tahoe, or if I need to leave Davis and head on down to LA, I can do it. But that electric vehicle will provide me with that day-to-day, that second vehicle choice. So we asked people to kind of rank. After we did the ranking, we asked them to indicate to us, well, what of these factors here, so things like range, availability, fuel availability, the fuel cost price, and then a few other factors related to confidence and then concerns about greenhouse gas emissions. What was the importance of these factors in the decisions that you made about the rankings? You certainly see these issues related to range anxiety and where am I going to be able to fill up or get my vehicle recharged come to the forefront. What you don't see is a whole lot of people making their ranking decisions based on things like greenhouse gas emissions. still a little bit of concern about the technology, but I think we're still dealing with those top, 3 or so characteristics factors as influencing that decision. And how do we start looking at solutions for those factors for individuals? Again, I mentioned early, my respondents didn't know a whole lot about the environmental impacts of vehicles, so maybe we could see an increase here if they had a clearer understanding of what those impacts were. So the modeling method that we used was called a panel rank order mixed logit. That in itself probably not very interesting to those of you in the room unless you're a passionate econometrician. But what it enabled us to do is really start evaluating and weighing off the trade-offs and these important interactions. I didn't present, I'm sure you've seen those presentations where you get an incredible table with really itsy-bitsy tiny numbers. I opted not to put that table on the screen to save our eyesight. And also, all the reports from the MetaNet Transportation Institute are available online. So if you're really excited and you want to look at all the coefficients and you want to play the numbers game, it's all available online that you can download for free. So this kind of summarizes the highlights from this modeling analysis. And actually, we probably could have all come into this room and had this discussion without me even having to have done the analysis. But it's nice to have, your a priori expectations in general confirmed. The first line item, this notion of vehicle type impacts your alternative fuel vehicle preference. Well, this makes sense. Whether you're looking at a big SUV, a truck, or a smaller sedan, the different technology behaves differently. We definitely had statistically significant results to say, an electric truck and a minivan was not popular among individuals, that there was definitely this negative relationship because the technology just hasn't advanced in a way that people were feeling comfortable about it. The cost that you'd have to pay to get the features and the performance that you wanted. We actually saw some kind of interesting results. Generally, geographic region didn't play a difference, but we did see that individuals living in the Northeast were far less interested in electric vehicles and compressed natural gas vehicles. I don't have a really good intuitive answer to this or explanation, so that might be something we can have a discussion. Can you explain to me why, Northeast residents aren't interested in these technologies? Some of it might relate to weather. I'm thinking, depending on the performance of the technology or their perception of the performance of the technology and weather. We didn't ask or give them any weather characteristics, but maybe people's perception of how they perform in weather. But then when you think about the fact that people in the Midwest didn't have those same results. So I can't really explain that one. We definitely saw that college education had showed a preference for hybrid electric vehicles. It didn't show up for the other technologies, possibly because there might be some greater skepticism about how realistic these technologies might be when you're talking about hydrogen fuel cell or something like that. We definitely saw that gender was not a player in this at all. There's kind of Susan mentioned that I do a lot of work on environmental behavior and things like that. And usually there's this kind of common understanding or perception that women tend to be more engaged in more pro-environmental behaviors than men. Now, it kind of depends on what the topic is and what the subject is. But I think here, when you're dealing with vehicles, you're talking about a major household decision. And oftentimes, if you're looking at what we still generally think of as a relatively traditional family here in the United States, you're not looking at that gender playing a role because you're looking at it as a household decision. Age was kind of interesting. It really does depend on the technology. And certainly we saw that younger respondents showed much greater interest in electric vehicles and even hydrogen fuel cell vehicles. And then broadly speaking, you definitely saw environmental attitudes, concerns about climate change, greenhouse gas emissions playing a role here. Definitely a preference for the hydrogen fuel cell and the EVs. definitely not for the compressed natural gas and the more traditional hybrids. I think because you're still looking at vehicles that rely predominantly on a fossil fuel-based technology.
You know, if you're controlling for that already,
Yes.
and so if you could run a test by dropping out that last one.
Okay, that's a great idea. I love it. So, and then what we got were kind of these trade-offs. So those were the interactions. And then, as I mentioned from the very beginning, you know, one of the things most people do in these kind of studies is look at these specific dollar value trade-offs between the cost, the fuel, range, et cetera. And economists love to talk about this concept called utility. How do we keep people's utility unchanged when you start weighing these trade-offs? Now, the numbers themselves, I've given you the very specific numbers. This is the one where I kind of go against my general approach, where I try not to give too many numbers. But what these numbers represent is kind of a broader issue or a broader philosophy that I'll talk about. So when you think about these trade-offs, so how do we compensate people? How do we leave that econometric or that economic utility unchanged? So in the difference between an alternative fuel vehicle and a gas vehicle, well, you can compensate it. You know, you can even that out by saying, all right, you can provide people with a $300 increase in fuel cost savings over 12,000 miles, which is about what we were looking for, kind of an annual typical distance someone might drive. Kind of this is what people are thinking about, or what you can say this is telling us is people are really thinking about the payback period. They're willing to invest in a technology if they're going to see a payback period that kind of gets them that money back, that initial cost investment back over, you know, a relatively short period of time. You're looking about little over 3 years, assuming 12,000 miles a year. And considering the fact that, again, most people are keeping their vehicles for around 9 years. So those are the kind of payback periods that you're looking for. These next two really are driven kind of a whole lot more by the electric vehicles. Because obviously when you think about range, among the other technologies, there isn't a whole lot of difference in range. And when you're talking about 17.5 miles, that's a really specific number. But really it's driven by this range anxiety related to the electric vehicles. And then the same thing kind of comes in place here with that 7.8 minute reduction in refueling time. How do we increase the convenience, the availability, our refueling infrastructure, actually across all of these technologies? But because we are doing it in this kind of minute increments, a lot of times you're looking at the EVs were kind of coming out there as being a major push, I think, why people were concerned about the recharging time. They don't want to be stuck on the road and having to, you know, sit there for 30 minutes and recharge their vehicle or something like that. And then this is just another way of looking at it. If we do show a decrease in range, you need to compensate that by a decrease in refueling times. Basically, you can run these numbers to kind of get any comparison that you want. And the actual data and all of the numbers to do this are in the MTI report with instructions on how to do it as well. So where do we end up? So when we think about kind of the main conclusions that we draw, we're looking at environmental performance. Much as you kind of, I want to see that as a driving factor, it certainly does not appear to be a driving factor among most people, most U.S. residents when they're choosing their vehicle. And it doesn't seem to be something that's leading purchasing decisions anytime in the near future either. Kind of more interesting, I thought, was that every alternative fuel vehicle did get ranked first for at least some characteristics of the combinations that we considered. And certainly you were seeing that the hybrids were the most popular. And then obviously the electric vehicles were the least popular. And in fact, I think actually a relatively recent article came out from researchers here in Davis looking at a San Diego study. And I think they actually ended up, again, with a similar study or similar results in terms of this EVs not being a particular favorite among their respondents in San Diego. And then we still kind of see this lack of understanding between the links between the vehicle use, the environmental impacts, and whether you're dealing with local air pollution, public health, climate change. So some, public policy opportunities there. So that kind of brings me to the end of the formal part, and I think the more fun part is here to come with questions. In the back, and then the gentleman at the table. That is a really good question. I actually don't know the answer to that. I'd have to check. I don't know the answer. It's a really good question. And in fact, some of the more recent phone surveys that I've done, also through MTI, one of the things that we're doing now is we are absolutely including cell phones. I'd be surprised if it wasn't. Knowledge Networks is relatively big in this arena. I'd be really surprised if they weren't. But it's really important in this day and age to capture cell phones because you do have so many people that have given up their landline as well. So. Yes, yeah, and so kind of the question was kind of looking at this issue related to range. And so with the electric vehicles, we were looking at kind of three different range distances. I think it was 40, 120, and 250. And you're absolutely right. The difference of getting a range increase from 40 to 60 is a whole lot different than increasing the range from 250 to 270. I'm not 100% sure I follow the rest of the question. It's one of those moments where I wish Jean-Daniel was here. Jean-Daniel is my econometric modeling guru. But I think what we're agreeing is that issue related to range is really important, and that the variability it matters far more at that 40 distance than it did for the 250. Now, in terms of the modeling, I'd have to actually probably check with Jean-Daniel to know exactly how that gets captured on kind of a nonlinear basis. Yes. Sure, in the back. Yeah, so kind of the question relates to this notion of familiarity with the technology. And I think, or familiarity with anything. Whenever you're doing a state of preference survey, you're really asking people to kind of project about an experience they probably have absolutely zero experience with. Now, certainly some of our respondents might have dabbled with a traditional hybrid, but even that's still a small percentage. Even that was a chance that there weren't a whole lot. I'd actually be interested. So my argument or my response back is yes, as people become more familiar with the technologies, seeing how you actually use them. Electric vehicles. Wait a minute. I saw a recent article, actually just a couple weeks ago, that people who had originally bought these as a secondary vehicle are now switching and using them as a primary vehicle because they're finding it's far more reliable. They're having a much better experience with that vehicle than they ever thought they would. Is there anyone in the room who actually was involved with that San Diego study? No? So maybe. So there was an article published in Energy Policy in 2013 that did this really interesting design game analysis with people. Okay. So is that something that you were seeing with those results in terms of kind of particularly with the plugins, which I'm guessing more people had been familiar with, did you see anything suggesting that as people were more comfortable with the technologies, or someone who had owned a hybrid was ranking them or playing that game a little bit differently than someone who had only owned a conventional vehicle? Okay. Okay. Okay, so kind of the results there, and San Diego, is I'm guessing the sample size is representative of San Diego, but we can't really take those San Diego data and dump it into Iowa or something like that. But I think it's confirming what your question was asking, is that these hybrid owners were much more likely to design and pick the plug-in hybrid because they'd already somewhat comfortable with that technology, and then were more receptive to basically a similar technology with this extra add-on feature.
Preparing for the San Diego study, that about a third of the people outside of California believe that the hybrid car back in 2011 is a car that you plug in because it's a hybrid electric. And I don't know what they think about the difference between hydrogen and natural gas, because it's exactly the same car for the user.
Mm-hmm.
Plug it in with some compressed gas and driving. So, and natural gas you can actually also put gasoline in it.
Mm-hmm.
Did you tell them all of these options and education before they start?
Yeah, so the short answer, and so the kind of summarizing the question, is kind of how much information do we give people when we're having them do that contingent ranking exercise? Are they really getting a full understanding? The short answer to your question is no. You cannot give enough of that information so that people can really truly understand the differences. What we do, and the way knowledge networks set up is, you basically had these kind of comparison panels that came up. And then they had kind of clickable hyperlinks that would allow them to, let's say, on a hydrogen fuel cell. So you could click on that and get a bit more information, so that we tried to provide some. Everyone got kind of the standard, kind of an explanation of each vehicle, but it was maybe 3 sentences. Not really enough to get at some of those nuances that you're talking about. And then they also had the ability to click and get more information. How many people actually clicked and got more information? I don't know. I look at, we get how long it takes people to do the survey, and my guess is, given that most were completing this in about 15 to 20 minutes, and it was, I think, a relatively complex survey. They're still going through it pretty quickly. You obviously got a few that just left it sitting open on their computer running all day because, 10 hours later they're finishing the survey. But when they're only spending maybe 15 to 20 minutes on the survey, I don't think they're really delving in and clicking on those links and getting as much information. A small percentage probably are, but I think far more are seeing hydrogen fuel cell and thinking about, the Hindenburg or some other fear they have about the technology, possibly. Yeah,
Interesting to see if that
it is. And actually, I'd love to, and in fact, I probably will go contact knowledge networks and ask them, do you know exactly how many people clicked on those? Yes, sir. Oh, and then. Okay, yeah. So kind of the question is looking at, so for someone who said, yes, I'm an early adopter, did we not test, but kind of evaluate, how much do you actually understand and know? We didn't. It'd actually be a great thing to do. We had a really tiny percentage, I think it was 3% or less, who considered themselves early adopters, and it never came into play as a statistically significant variable in the model. But I think that it's kind of a worthy follow-up question, because I think we would be interested in seeing. I'd probably have to rephrase the first question a little bit to then capture, well, then what do you actually know about these technologies? Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in fact, so kind of the comment relates to the fact that, in other similar studies, you've seen some of these factors play out slightly differently. This issue of geographic region, gender. I'm wondering, because we didn't include plug-in hybrids, if plug-in hybrids are this really unique segment of the market. Again, I think it's one of those things we can argue. Did we make the right decision in not including a plug-in hybrid alternative? The geographic region, our coefficients, even the one that northeast on the EV and the CNG was so minorly statistically significant. It is kind of interesting, and I'd love to sit down and compare more and loop Jean Daniel into the question, because I think that it's really important, and particularly from the perspective of manufacturers, where do you target different products? Where do you target rollouts of new technologies? So it would be interesting. I think there's an incredible opportunity to do more. I will never say that we've solved all of the issues related to household preferences. Every time you frame the question, every time you ask the question, you're seeing it done a little bit differently in different studies. The San Diego study I was talking about used this really neat design game where people got to design their own. There was some customization in ours, but pretty much if you came in and you selected you were going to be buying a truck, you were really only given truck options to consider. And there's downfalls to that. So I think what we're getting at least I'm hoping what we're getting at, is this opportunity as we really do need more research on this area. You need to take advantage of all of you young folk who are just entering into kind of the research field to figure out some of these complex questions.
They don't buy cars.
They don't buy cars. So. Don't train them in Davis to buy cars. Okay, so the question really kind of summarizes, when you're using these state of preference surveys with new technology, people are unfamiliar with them, how likely is it that the future is going to reflect what the results of this study are saying? I I guess what I'd say is that when you put them all together and you take the collective work on these studies, that's where you start to get insight. I don't know that any one single study gives you what you're looking for. But I think if you start to see replication, similar trends, that's, I think, where you get more powerful information from these kind of studies. The issue on kind of the hybrids, the plug-in hybrids versus that pure EV. I mean, I think that's kind of a really interesting result or outcome, that those pure EVs still aren't necessarily feeling the love from consumers. And if we want to increase that share, what are some of the things that we can do? Now, in terms of your question on how do we, or I don't know if this was actually your question, but something I would certainly love to see on stated preference surveys or these similar kind of choice modeling experiments is, really truly test out the method itself. Take that same set of individuals and present them with this type of stated preference choice experiment, that type, 6 different other types, and really start comparing the methods themselves in some kind of apples to apples comparison, because I think a lot of times what we're ending up with is apples to oranges, because everything about these studies is just slightly different. The sample, the approach, and finding some sort of better way of comparing the method itself, I think would be really quite interesting. It's kind of interesting. I certainly would acknowledge networks, because but I guess anytime you have a sample, you have access to that sample. Certainly, money is always an issue. We have a really limited budget on this study. One of the things I've learned from the MTI projects is they tend to be limited financial resources. But with infinite money, can you imagine what we could do? So, sir.
So earlier you said that in your model, or earlier on in the survey, you asked questions to determine how, like they're factual questions rather than opinion questions, to determine how well they understood. Part of my question is, was that understanding environmental results, or is that understanding what the different technologies were?
Okay, so kind of the question relates to, could I clarify a little bit more what some of those environmental impacts of vehicle knowledge questions were? They really weren't looking much at the technology. They weren't questions about the technology. They weren't really particularly sophisticated questions. They were questions trying to get at, did people understood that different vehicles have different rates of emissions? This notion of, does a truck emit pollution differently than a compact car and things like that. They were pretty straightforward, and people didn't even know those kind of questions. Okay, so kind of your question is, did that environmental knowledge, did their score on the kind of, if we created, and actually we didn't. And actually it's a really neat idea. So what we could have done, which we didn't do, was kind of create a knowledge scale. So how knowledgeable are you about the environmental impacts? And then use that on how they inform the rankings. We didn't do it like that. We did look at their concern about issues related to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change, and those variables did come into play. But we didn't create kind of a metric evaluating someone's knowledge. It's kind of a neat idea.
Your earlier statement was that, by and large, most of them didn't know very much.
They didn't.
and so you only have a sample of maybe 400 folks actually answering the state of preference.
No, you're probably right on that. But kind of I like the idea of where you're going, and I look at kind of a future opportunity. Earl, and then oh, hello. Oh, can I do Earl first and then you? Okay, thank you.
Comment on consumer love for the product. I think there's been a sea change in the recent weeks regarding Tesla and electronic vehicles. They've had national headlines on two areas. One is that Tesla was ranked number one among all cars in some sort of measure. And that was a headline. And the other was that Tesla is going to spend more than $1 billion building a new battery factory somewhere. And that electric vehicle sales, they're expecting to increase from 35,000 to 500,000. Do you think that's going to change people's attitudes towards electric vehicles?
Yeah, so kind of the comment related to this idea that as people hear more and hear more positive things about technologies, let's take electric vehicles, the example is a Tesla, will that change perception? I think what you have to do is kind of balance out, are they also hearing negative things? The flip side of that was a couple months ago, I saw an article come out that talked about, I guess a lot of the rental car companies were actually including electric vehicles in their rental car fleets, although you were paying a premium. It was kind of like the difference between getting your Kia and upgrading to, the Mustang or something like that. But the electric vehicle was this option. And they were basically dumping the electric vehicle fleet because people weren't interested in either paying the premium, or there was kind of a fear of, I'm not comfortable with this technology. What happens when I get stuck with my 40 miles? Or possibly with rental fleets. And I guess it depends. I don't know enough about the rental fleet market. But if people are getting that rental car and they want to be able to just zip around, if they have it overnight, where are they going to charge it? I don't know that rental car companies were the best place to be testing this. But I think they have to see those both stories and kind of trade them off. So, sorry. So we basically had a couple of questions that simply asked people. Actually, we've done it a couple of different ways. In this study, we actually really only had these one or two questions that asked about their concern related to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. We didn't do any other modeling with it. We didn't ask like a set of questions, something along the line of a new ecological paradigm or something like that, and do factor analysis. It was just that single question coming into the model. Yes. So again, so what we had related to kind of how were we measuring, and it's an admittedly or arguably a relatively poor measure of environmental attitudes. It were these two questions, one related to concern about greenhouse gas emissions, and then more broadly, no, wait a minute, actually. Let me pause on that because I've got the study right here. I want to get the exact question.
He's making a point about the econometrics.
Oh, okay.
He's just wanting to establish it as an explanatory variable.
Yes.
That's
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I
Thank
believe,
you.
right? That's the point you're asking.
Explanatory.
Variable. They didn't have a latent variable for environmental attitude.
Because if you have the latent variable, then the age would be used in that variable. Within that variable, and if we see the original framework, the gender should be impacting the environmental attitude.
I think that's what you were saying earlier, right?
Well, sure, but
So.
he's well-trained gentleman back here.
A light bulb.
There are these hybrid choice models that
Okay.
are becoming more popular, where you really it's frowned upon to sort of stick an attitudinal variable in as an explanatory variable, right? That really you should be. There's some underlying latent variables that are driving both the answer to the attitudinal
Yes,
question
I
and the choice.
totally get what you're getting at
And
now.
that's a more complicated methodology,
So.
which you could do, but
Yeah, actually, it's one of those moments where I'm like, oh, I wish Jean Danielle was here. No, I totally get actually what you're going for there, because you've got what is predicting the environmental attitudes, what's predicting the choice, and things like that. To answer your question, there were only 2 variables, and in fact, I misspoke once. One was simply a variable looking at concern with greenhouse gases, and one actually had nothing about environmental. It was concerned with oil imports. So, nothing to do with environmental attitudes at all. So there was just the one variable. Yes. Mm-hmm. So, absolutely, makes total sense to me. Thank you. So, in fact, it's one of those things, when you have a kind of a limited set of questions you can ask your survey respondent. We ended up not having very many. I've done other studies which had a whole host of questions that were designed to kind of tease out these environmental attitudes. We ended up being really limited into what we could do because the contingent ranking exercise took up so much of the time. But it's again one of those great opportunities where now to go find another sort of pocket of money, go back, do a better job of the study this time. Mm-hmm. They ran, so knowledge networks, they provide the sample, they programmed the survey, they ran the survey, they pestered the survey respondents, so they do all the kind of follow-up. And they don't do follow-up just by email, they will do a phone call follow-up as well. They provide, and then obviously they provide the data set. They also provide a kind of nice summary report. Because of what we ended up modeling, we didn't use their summary report, but it's a nice one for basic statistics. I think it was around 25,000. So not for a survey, probably not horribly expensive. I'm not 100% sure of that number, but I think somewhere around 20, 25.
So like 800.
Yes.
I looked it up here actually. They've got cell phone only households.
Oh, good.
They also, I think you mentioned, they specifically recruit non-internet households.
Yes.
And get them to participate.
Yes, they're definitely looking for non-internet. And that answered that question from earlier, the cell phone households.
Yeah.
No.
About these guys being a professional survey.
So in terms of the 43,000 panel, I don't think that what did they say? I don't know that any survey, any participant gets more than 4 surveys a month. So they're never going to make, maybe they're also then seeking out other surveys, but because they get recruited into this one by telephone, it's kind of random that they would be contacted into this group in the first place. Now maybe once they're in that Knowledge Networks panel, then they're going out and they're seeking more survey business as a respondent.
The thing is that they claim to have, they've got a very, very long list of demographic variables here, and they claim that the sample they're producing, that they're selling to you, is a representative sample of the United States according to a huge number of demographic variables. And so, okay, is there a latent variable of inclined to fill surveys out or not? Maybe so, but that's not going to make that any different than the data you're getting or I'm getting from some other place, right? And is it correlated in any way that's meaningful with preferences? I don't know. Yeah,
It's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting company to work with Knowledge Networks. We've used them once before. Susan mentioned I do a lot of work in the world of electronic waste and household waste recycling and management, and it's kind of the other research hat I wear is in the world of recycling. And we've used them before. And it's a professional company to work with. But you're always going to have some pros and cons. There's always some opportunity for debate. And in fact, when the team at UC Irvine originally chose to go with knowledge networks, there was a lot of debate. And this was 2006, I think, they first worked with knowledge networks. And it was a great, very, very robust discussion about the value of going with this company.
Hard to get a
For us, the nice thing about it is that you did get the demographics. The number of times I've gotten surveys that had partial demographics, didn't have any, people filled out part of the survey and then left all the demographics blank. And those are important variables. We want to know about the respondents. And you just always know that you're getting it. We did, yes. So you don't spend any time of your survey asking demographic questions. They just give that to you.
Did they get an incentive? Did you have an incentive in yours, or just part of the deal?
No,
They
yeah.
recruit the people.
Exactly. So there was no incentive as part of our survey. Now, Knowledge Networks has their own kind of incentive point system that their participants were part of, but we didn't add in anything else. Yeah, thank you. It's incredibly fortunate and just a delight and honor to be here at UC Davis, particularly talking about this. You guys are really kind of the leaders, the forefront of this topic in many different ways. So thank you very much for inviting me. So, well, I certainly do think so. So thank you very much.
You need to use those for the campus travel service. I'll probably keep them. I got 600 respondents. I can do this. It's a totally different. Part of it was snowball sampling, and part of it was the campus travel service. I don't know. Not having looked at it, it seems like it might be. It's only not company. Definitely. I wasn't curious. Yeah. That's good. our discretionary research account, something like that.
Okay, so it doesn't.
Yeah.
I would assume that's right. So,
In that,
Thanks for all
versus,
Well,
you don't get it any.
There's already a lot of
more
there.
sophisticated.
this study you couldn't if you wanted.
That's to everybody.
And just the
the whole thing about the D's. Not that I was
towards
into
environmental.
that, but it
Yeah,
sounded like you had a
no.
strong opinion
Well, all
about
right,
it.
yeah, so lots of different reasons. I mean, one, there's some personality issues.
I don't think.
A whole bunch of
They
things
don't.
correlated
There's
with density.
no
Yeah, I mean, we
the
have
average
higher
person
density.
really underlies.
Yeah,
If they
yeah.
listen at all. Oh, yeah, and kind of figuring
I
out,
just,
you
any
know, it'd be
opportunity
interesting, we could pull out,
I
we
would
only had
love
like
it.
15 minutes or so.
I didn't know actually we were going to be covering.
All the time, but if you were less interested.
So it's basically, I was basically
Could you
saying the
put
same
in a
thing.
more sophisticated
Yeah, that's what I gathered from all that.
Yeah, and then you have some of the stuff you had
Yeah, like he was really big on that.
Oh, yeah.
I'm only somewhat
Yeah,
familiar with
it is important. Yeah.
I had a lot more on it.
for a while and after that.
In that article.
Oh, whatever. I mean, I can just go hang out at the train station if you want to drop
Yeah,
me
we
off.
need-
No, before and after.
The other thing is, I suggested to her that I would be much happier with $100 or $125 donation because I'm afraid, particularly for people from the Bay Area, there's extra expense coming out here and things, and they've been giving. Well, you got two. Right. No, but I can handle up to 60. I told, and I told her that I was hoping to get at least 40.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
all right. Then I don't.
And particularly like people in the greater Sacramento, for example, I'll get the Sacramento, that planning association thing, and I'll get DK to
train. Oh, she was too.
That's not the best example, but
what I'm planning. First she said, send it to me, and then I'll revise it and send it to
For the website, kind of get the itinerary.
right.
Well,
Well,
people
let
once it's funds.
from her. Now, what this basically says is, I've got a line in here that encourages people to take the train. This is the format you had there, and maybe it has to be. She's going to have to cut. But anyway, I wanted to put are encouraged to take, and I'm going to have the start be at the plaza next to the train station. And she says on the sign up, we shouldn't give them too many details. But people who do sign up, I'm going to ask everyone how you intend to come to the tour. And
I
Different
figured that
colors.
out.
Sorry about
bike
that.
over here. Because depending on what it is, the ideal thing is people all come on the train and get off here, and the train arrives at 9:17. At 9:30, we do a welcome hello, we bicycle to City Hall, and go around. People who don't have a bike who are on the train, I can get people to drive to B&L Bike Shop, which is about right. Which is right here. That was clear. And for $15, they'll rent a bike with them. And for people who are driving, don't have a bike, but then they're going to have to find a place to park.
Yeah, well, we could probably just delete that.
For people who say they are driving and need to rent a bike.
You know which paper you said.
Yeah, well, there aren't very many.
Okay, so yeah, so
Yeah.
we can get.
Is here, and for $19 they will rent, and this shopping center has vacant spots in it, which in theory are only for customers. But you're a
It's
customer.
okay, we
I
can
will
mention
tell
these
people,
questions.
if you rent the bike there, we'll give you.
Yeah,
you
I
can
try not
park
to-
your car for free. And then, hopefully, if they're there soon enough, they can make it down by 9:30. Here, it's only 3 o'clock.
Yeah, I think once people sign
Yeah,
up,
I
then
mean-
we can do it.
And we don't have a lot of support for creeks and stuff, but I'm going to have probably set up at City Hall. I'm going to have a 1-hour sit-down session. And I will have water bottles.
But if you're not here all year, then I don't have to worry about money.
Catherine Hess is not going to be available because she's doing the 5-tour New York City bike ride. Which is a couple days later. She's by the way, to the APA conference in Atlanta, and I've signed up for 3 tours. In very different. Atlanta isn't a great biking place, but they claim to have done innovative things in various places and have 3 different tours and bike tours. Bike tours. But Steve Tracy and a whole bunch of others says you're gonna have too many people falling by the side, and I've been cutting it back and cutting it back. What I'm gonna do is ask people, do you prefer, are you special interest in safe routes to school, active transportation, sustainable development, or any of the above? And I've got Jennifer Dolan Wyatt, who works for Alta, who's done the safe routes to school stuff here, who will be with us all day. And DK will do. I can put any active transportation people with it. DK is going to be with us all day. Steve Tracy will be with us all day, and I'll let him handle the people who want to do sustainable development, and I'll take what's left. They wanted to put the price at $125 for the public and $50 for students. And I recommended that $125 I thought was going to be a hard sell, especially to get people to come from the Bay Area because they have added expense. Maybe the $125 will go in Pasadena, where people are in LA. But here, and I said I'd feel much better if you drop it to 100, and I'll push hard to get people from Greater Sacramento region to come as well. She was thinking that maybe only 20 would come. I told her I would be hoping for at least double that. Let me throw one of the options out. And then all that needs to be the bikes that are on 8th Street near I think Richfield. There's 6 bicycles on a fence. They can save a couple minutes if they're going straight across Russell rather than going around and past that. But I like them to see that for art, and then I like them to approach Russell by coming through College Park. And then the grand finale is hopefully going to be a finished bike diet on, road diet on from A to, they would ride A to G. When are you doing? 2nd of May. You thought you were going to be gone then. I am gone. You think it's maybe going to be just still a work in progress? I know that they've pushed everything back a couple months.
I know. I hope it's done because we need to do the after like head counts in mid-May from last year, and definitely before the students leave.
Yeah.
I'm hoping it's got to be done by May 15th. Hopefully a little early. Yeah, hopefully.
I'm revising my bicycle-friendly Debris thing to present it in China in June, and it would be available here or in the fall or something.
You want to do a fall?
Yeah. I've got
Spring.
I've got pictures of places like I did Paris, London, Belgrade, and I got some really nice ones from China. Greatest urban bike ride I've had is Singapore now. Have you bicycled in Singapore ever? Along the East Coast Parkway, and they've got one one bridge that's out.
What happened to the other three?
A couple of them hadn't biked in years and didn't know how to bike, and they dropped out. And we had to go on local streets for a mile. But hopefully in another 6 months or so, there's going to be a clean shot where you can bike for up to 10 miles along a bike paths in a park, and then you can bicycle on areas where you're about half a mile away from all the skyscrapers in downtown, and you actually even come into within less than a quarter of a mile. Absolutely incredible views of it. Their big wheel, which is as big as the London High Flyer and stuff.
Thank you. That was wonderful. Yeah, no, that was. I think you did a beautiful job of presenting that at just the right level.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Well, like I said, for some of the questions, I was like, oh, I didn't know you did this. Or the modeling.
I know.
I was like,
Yeah, I do so much presenting of the modeling my students do now.
I was like,
Don't ask me questions. You got a chance to chat with Ken.
yes, I've never met him before. I've been reading his stuff for years. I was like, oh, this is wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. It's everybody's doing it a different method, a different population. You're going to get slightly different answers. But there's a lot of consistency.
There is. I mean, you know, kind of you take away the specific details, and I'm never particularly interested in specific numbers, but the broad general. But I'd love to do one of these. Asha and I are doing actually a study. We're doing an onboard transit survey, but all we're doing is comparing different modes of doing the onboard transit survey because no one's really done it. So we're doing a paper-based, we're doing a tablet-based, we're doing kind of a postcard internet option, and it's as close as we can get to apples to apples. And you just don't see that very often. You never see it in this kind of stuff.
Yeah. In fact, yeah, I'm waiting to hear about this paper that I realized I submitted 2 years ago. And I warned me it was going to be a long wait, but it wasn't supposed to be 2 years before I did. But it compared
Okay, that's excellent.
compared a phone and a paper survey, or yeah, this was an online survey.
Well, and then just finding some things. That's right.
Do anybody that's doing stuff with bus rapid transit?
I do too much transit work too.
Because I've become very interested in that, and I got a chance to ride the Istanbul BRT for a whole day, and I'm going to make my second day ride on Guangzhou in June, and I've done Curitiba
Stop talking about this stuff.
Huh?
And we can go about that.
You're making us jealous.
Oh, I know.
Yeah, you got